We have got a jam-packed show tonight. We have, of course, Stanton Friedman, who is a nuclear physicist lecturer, who was at one of the first civilian at Roswell and has been doing everything and anything to do with UFO, including dealing with the congressional hearings on UFOs since. We are also going to have, just for a few minutes, a friend of mine. There's a benefit for his niece. I'm going to have him come on just for a few minutes right after Stanton to talk a little bit about that.
A little bit about some of his work.
Oh, that would be great.
I mean, because I've seen the man speak live. He's autographed my copy of the book that I have in front of me.
Which is the one you just mentioned, right?
Yeah, Flying Saucers and Science. A scientist investigates the mysteries of UFOs. He is also a co-author of the book Captured, which had all about the Betty and Barney Hill incident, which was one of the first reported cases of UFO abductions and missing time and all that kind of stuff.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Missing time. See, now you're talking my language. That is. When we start getting into things like that, because I think that is some of it's so related. And we've talked about this.
Sure.
Even some of it, like what people may think are, UFOs or aliens and ghosts and all that, just time related. There's some.
Well, Betty and Barney Hill witnessed a UFO and didn't know that they witnessed it. They saw something, then experienced a loss of time. They didn't remember any of this until they were under hypnosis. A while after their incident, they both experienced headaches, just weird anomalies that they couldn't figure out, so they tried hypnotherapy, and under hypnosis it was revealed to them, and they did this separately. So they each, if they practiced this was the most well-versed, well-practiced lie of all time, but everybody absolutely believes their story. And under hypnosis, they revealed that they were taken aboard a UFO for a length of time, and then they were put back in their car and headed off in the right direction, which would account for their missing time. But, that wasn't all. The aliens told them where they were from. And under hypnosis, Betty Hill drew a star chart of a binary star system called Zeta Reticuli. Gave it to astrophysicists at the time, and no one could identify it, so they said. Turns out a number of years later, I don't know if it was the Hubble, but it was discovered a star system that matched up exactly to how she had drawn it. And she's not an astrophysicist by trade, so there's no way she could have known how that star system was going to look like, especially under hypnosis, but she drew it under hypnosis.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
Without a doubt, that's very interesting, if anything.
A lot of these things like this, it's like, you do have to question, like, how is it possible, and what's the cause of it? I don't know. And as far as the missing time and the alien probing, if you will, they were the first case recorded to have done all that. Just about every other abduction case stems from these two. These are the Adam and Eve of abduction cases. They were the first ones, I suppose. They probably weren't ever the first ones if you buy into the whole ancient aliens theory, and they've been around for a really, really long time. But as far as documented cases, they were certainly one of the first. And, of course, there's a Star Wars connection to all this. 6 degrees of Star Wars, I'll call it. And what is that?
Well, there's a made-for-TV movie out in the 70s, and Barney Hill was played by one James Earl Jones, who was, of course, the voice of Darth Vader.
Who? What? Wait, repeat that?
There was a made-for-TV movie made about the Betty and Barney Hill incident back in the 70s, and the actor who played Barney Hill was James Earl Jones. Star Wars fans know him best as the voice of Darth Vader.
Really?
I don't make this stuff up. If I did, I'd be in Hollywood writing stories.
I don't make this stuff up. Yours is just to report it, right?
Right. Well, I'm not the first to report it. Anyone who knows anything ought to know this stuff by now. But
well, you know what? That's like true for all of us. To some degree,
a lot of what we all do is regurgitate information from other sources.
Right. But there's always someone who's like, wow, I never knew that before. And that's why, in turn, that's why I like doing this stuff. For those who hadn't heard it or didn't know, there's only one way to find out is to hear it from somebody, and then you can go on from there. And
exactly.
That's spreading the word, man.
Exactly, and start just basically, researching it yourself, which is a serious, I'll tell you what, because this, I'm hesitant and you're hesitant to get in because we're trying to wait for Stanton right now. And next week is going to be, if anybody who's listening to us, if you want to tune in next week too, because we are going to have another part in the series on transhumanism, cyborgism to some degree. There's different aspects of it. And so a very interesting gentleman will be on, David Ketch. And, but anyway, so, wait, someone's calling.
Oh, go ahead, go.
Okay.
Hi, Stanton Friedman here.
Hey, here we go.
How are you? Thank you so much for calling us.
I guess you couldn't get through.
No, I was looking and I was trying to get you through Skype, and we were, doing the on-air stall, and then it was finally and I usually talk to the audience and let them know what's going on, so it was like, please call. So I'm so glad that you did. What an honor to have you on the show. Thank you.
My pleasure.
And
beautiful Fredericton, New Brunswick, Canada.
New Brunswick, that's where you're at. Okay.
This is Greg, my co-host. So,
hello there.
Hi.
We have had such a stir. I just want to let you know over you being on the show tonight. So that's a good.
Are they going to picket the station?
Exactly. Right. It's like, what is it? Well, I'm sure you've had your share of troubles with.
Not really. No. I've given over 700 lectures. I've had 11 hecklers, and 2 of them were drunk. So.
Nice.
And I come on very strong. So no, I don't worry about it.
That's good.
I know. I've seen you speak live, and I can attest to that. You hold an audience very, very well.
Well, that's what communication's all about. It's
Absolutely.
not just me talking. They got to be listening.
Right.
Before I basically, because I know that Greg is going to be chomping at the bit here with questions for you, Stanton, is that I do have one just kind of question here. How has your family been I know you've been obviously doing this for years and years. Have they always been supportive of what you're doing and your hypothesis or theories on the topic of UFOs?
Well, as long as the bills get paid, my wife doesn't care. My son was very interested in what I do. They have no reason to worry about it. I worked in industry for 14 years. We had to move around the country several times because they canceled the darn programs. And that's a much bigger thing than canceling a radio program, I'll tell you.
What is
go on.
I was going to say, because you're talking about canceling the programs as far as the government.
Well, I worked on government-sponsored research and development projects. For example, the General Electric Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program back in 1958. Worked there for 3 years. That year, in 58, we spent $100 million. We employed 3,500 people, of whom 1,100 were engineers and scientists. So it wasn't a small program. Back then, $100 million was a lot of money. And then after 3 years, they canceled the program. Somebody else was going to get the money, Cold War and so forth. And 3 years here, 3 years there, and most of them were pretty good-sized programs. And the funny thing was, like when I worked for Westinghouse on nuclear rocket engines, we had a very successful test. And within a short while, they canceled the program. Okay. So that was frustrating. And, so that I'm now my own boss, and that gives you a lot more flexibility. I don't worry about anybody giving me a hard time. I don't need to please somebody by compromising my standards and stuff like that. So it's been good. I gave my first lecture in 1967, went full-time in 1970. That's a long time.
It sure is. I was astounded just before you came on. I was, reading some of the information from your bio, and to say impressive is not even, doesn't even do it justice.
I had a very similar question. It's funny that you brought it up because, Stanton, later on in the show, I'm going to bring up a few of the ever popular, ever controversial September 11th conspiracy theories, whether you buy into them or not. But I'm having it out with a really, really close friend of mine, and we've been friends for a long time. I was in his wedding, he was in my wedding. We've known each other a while. But every time I bring up September 11th, he goes bonkers, absolutely bonkers. So bonkers to the fact it may strain our friendship. And the question that I had, and you partially answered, is that has that happened during some of your UFO research? Has it ever come to blows? And I'm sure it has with different opinions, that sort of thing.
Not really.
No, not so much. Well, good.
No. Well, why should it? I present facts and data. Oh, there are some people who get upset, but
sure.
I try to be very careful in what I say. I worried when I started lecturing that somebody would come up with something that would destroy my whole argument.
Right.
And it didn't take me very long to find out that wasn't going to happen, partly because the nasty, noisy negativists never know what they're talking about.
Right.
That's probably very true for many different fields.
Yes.
Because I noticed that seems to be, a large concern that I've read in print that you're writing the same thing. Well, obviously they haven't really read my books, or they really haven't checked the facts.
Well, there are 4 basic rules for debunkers on any subject. Don't bother me with the facts. My mind's made up. What the public doesn't know, I'm not going to tell them. If you can't attack the data, attack the people. It's easier and nobody will know the difference. And do your research by proclamation. Investigation is too much trouble. And those rules will get you on top of the nasty, noisy, negativist group all the time.
Right, and it's
but
funny
I don't put up with that kind of garbage.
Right. And this is the first time that he's really attacking me, and it's never come down to that before. And I keep telling him that these are not my theories. I didn't wake up one day and decide, geez, 9/11 may have been an inside job. I better check into it and tell all my friends. It wasn't like that. I mean, this is looking at stuff from a really, really long time, and just open your eyes, see what's there, and he won't. Again, they're not my facts. I wasn't an investigative journalist at ground zero. I mean, I wasn't there, but I think some of these theories are interesting. Anyways, I don't want to go too far into that. But well, good. I'm glad you haven't run into too much of that. You're right. Stay on top of the facts. Make them think about it.
I am not a masochist.
Right.
And I see it in different because I do deal more with in paranormal, but dealing with ghosts and hauntings, and I see a lot of that too, where just a lot of uneducated people that just refuse to look at the facts, whether in positive light or negative light, for that matter, saying something is that it isn't or vice versa. It's so frustrating. Very frustrating.
If you get involved on that level.
Right.
Do you think that Roswell really started you more, really getting into...
No. I was already I gave my first lecture in 1967. I first heard about Roswell in the 1970s, got heavily involved in 1978, and strictly by accident. I was in the right place at the right time. And I just heard the other day at a conference, somebody was saying, there was no Roswell, just Friedman's got things rolling, making up stories in the late 70s. Well, that's hogwash. And Roswell didn't energize me once I dug into it, but let me tell you how it happened. It was very straightforward. I was at a television station to promote my lecture that evening at Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the university had sent me over to the station, brought me there, and I was supposed to do 3 interviews, slow news day, I guess, and I did the first 2, and the third reporter was nowhere to be found. And the station manager, this is before cell phones came into wide use, he's looking at his watch, he's giving me coffee, he's embarrassed. He wanted to get the interview in, but he knew the people who brought me there, he knew I was busy and had things to do. And out of the blue, he says, the guy you ought to talk to is Jesse Marcel. And brilliant investigator that I am, I said, who's he? And his answer changed my life. He handled pieces of the wreckage of one of those UFOs you're interested in when he was in the military. What? Where'd that come from? I dropped my teeth. Well, what do you know about him? Well, he lives in Houma. That didn't tell me anything. Homa's a big city in Louisiana, but I didn't know where it was. I've been there since to talk to Jesse. But, we're old ham radio buddies. He's a good guy. I mean, there was nobody else around. He wasn't joking. This is a very serious discussion. You really ought to talk to him. He's a good guy. And then the reporter showed up. I was busy all day. The next day, I was early at the airport, so I called information. This is before the Internet, you understand, and got a number and talked to Jesse Marcel. And the thing that people don't realize, he didn't come running to me, but he couldn't deny that he was involved, as I found out later, because his name and picture were in the newspapers in 1947. I didn't know that when I called him, but of course I checked not long thereafter. And so he told me his story. And one of the things that gets left out by the nasty, noisy negativists is that Jesse was the intelligence officer for the most elite military group in the entire world. The 509th were the ones who had the atomic bomb. They dropped them on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They tested 2 more in 1946 at Operation Crossroads in the Pacific. This wasn't a bunch of dinks with nothing better to do. This is, and it's funny how the debunkers never mention that. We got one guy who's head of a skeptics group. Oh, it was an anonymous PR guy who put out an unauthorized press release. Total baloney. I mean, he didn't even know his name. I'd known the guy for 20 years when he made this stupid remark. But, I mean, it does make a difference when you say it was the only atomic bombing group in the world. And the guy who put out the press release, as a matter of fact, was a bombardier. And he dropped the instrument package at one of those 2 bomb tests that occurred in 1946. And you give that to your best people because if the instruments aren't in the right place, that you've wasted a test, and we didn't have any atom bombs to waste at that time. So it's so far from the truth when you get the noisy negativists at it that they're easy to refute. And I'll make an on-air challenge. I've done several debates, haven't lost any so far. And what becomes painfully obvious is how little the other guys know. They haven't done their homework. And as a nuclear physicist, you got to do your homework. You're not entitled to an opinion if you're going to claim to be a scientist. And I am a little sneaky sometimes. Often at my lectures, I talk about 5 large-scale scientific studies. I'll show a slide, PowerPoint these days, of course, and tell them what's in the study. And then I ask, how many people here have read this? And I practically never get more than 2% who've read any of the 5. So a guy's got to have some guts to take me on and admit, well, no, I haven't read any of those. That did happen once.
Oh, my God.
At a Gulf Research Labs dinner management club. Guy interrupts me 3 times. I say, I'll talk about that. Why don't you talk about this? I'll talk about that. Finally, the boss man says, let him finish. So I turn to him, and he says, well, I'm sure one could come to other conclusions than the ones you've come to. I said, well, let me see now. As I recall, you hadn't read any of those 5 large-scale scientific studies I talked about, right? Well, yeah, that's true. Well, then that's the difference between us, isn't it? I give you my conclusions. I give you the sources of my data on which I base my conclusions. You haven't read any of them. I've read all of them. Whose opinion is worth more? There was a long silence. Well, I don't need to be nasty, but I certainly don't need to be forgiving. Oh, poor guy. You're not entitled to an opinion. It's as simple as that. It's interesting that you mentioned ghosts because I was just at a conference in Atlanta, the big, it's not Comic-Con, it's the other big...
The Paracon?
Well, it's not Paracon either, but there's about 40,000 people there in 5 hotels, and they're all in costumes and all this kind of stuff.
Oh.
And
It is Comic-Con then. Something like that.
Well, no, but it's like it. Anyway, I met somebody there who investigates, I'll call it ghosts as a generic sort of term. Mm-hmm. And turns out using modern equipment, they're asking questions in buildings from 100 years ago and getting answers. And electric fields show up with the meters they have and stuff like that. Well, and I find that fascinating.
You know what? There is, I mean, just to kind of briefly say something on that, is that there is a lot of good progress being made. Unfortunately, there's a lot of uneducated people,
of course,
running around trying to mimic what they're seeing on television, and they don't even understand how this equipment works or what the data means, because they might get something. You're talking about electromagnetic fields. Well, you have to make sure it's not coming from a natural source. And just,
that's right.
Having a meter say, oh, you've got it's gone up, doesn't say, oh, that means it's a ghost. Things like that.
That's true. But I was fascinated in listening to her account. Very scientific. She's an anthropologist, archaeologist. And what I made a point, a lecture I gave 2 nights ago, that, almost all the great discoveries have been of things that we cannot see. Think about that for a minute. Bacteria, viruses, X-rays, neutrons, protons, DNA, radio waves, all these things. And they were all opposed. I have a book, Science Was Wrong. They're all opposed by very well-respected, high-ranking professional people who hadn't bothered to check the evidence, to look at anything. I mean, the number of quotes of smart people saying stupid things really is high. The top astronomer in the United States, in 1903 October, was quoted as saying that, in a much longer form than this, but basically if there's one thing he can be certain of is that man will never fly any distance in an airplane. And that was 2 months before the Wright brothers' first flight. Mm-hmm. And the British Astronomer Royal in 1956, space travel is utter bilge, she told Time magazine. And there's a whole long list of these things. And it's funny that you can laugh at them and so forth, but what's important is when big wheels say stupid things, they delay progress. Lord Kelvin said X-rays were a hoax. He also said the sun could only be 35 million years old because the only way to produce energy is burning gas. And you could see how much energy was produced, and it wouldn't last very long. And that's a key thing. The arrogance and the ignorance of the elite. If there were anything else true, I would know about it because I'm so smart, is the attitude. And those guys are, like I said, arrogant and ignorant. And I push nuclear. But why? Because if you look around the universe, you don't need to look far. Almost all the energy in the universe is produced by nuclear fusion. That's what goes on in the stars. It's not massive burning gas. Fusion is it. And, the outside of academia people realize that. Let's look just in a short period of time. In 1944, a big bomb in World War II was a 10-ton blockbuster. Made a big hole in the ground. It released the energy of 10 tons of dynamite. Took a big B-29 to carry it. That was 44. The next year, the first atomic bomb released the energy of 16,000 tons of TNT. That's a pretty big jump from 10 to 16,000. And we were really on a roll because in 1952, the United States tested Mike, the first fusion device, first fusion weapon, first H-bomb. It released the energy of 10 million tons of TNT.
Wow.
And the Russians, a few years later, tested one that released the energy of 57 million tons of TNT. So, in a 10-year period, we really showed that, hey, there's a source of energy. And I worked on a study of fusion propulsion for deep space travel in 1961.
Wow.
It would take money. Okay, I don't have the money. If you really want something bad enough, you pay for it. The government spent $10 billion to develop the stealth aircraft in 10 years in secret. And I get so irked at the ancient academics who say governments can't keep secrets. Dr. Seth Shostak, one of the SETI cultists that I focus on, SETI stands for Silly Effort to Investigate, S-E-T-I. He said the proof that the government can't keep secrets is how badly FEMA did with Katrina and how badly the post office operates. Now, there's a big disconnect there. These aren't the outfits that keep secrets. Try the CIA, the DIA, the NRO, all these guys. So you got to look at what's really happening in the world.
Do you find that a lot of things, whether it be to do with UFOs or aliens, and I again have this to do more with on the realm of it being haunting type of ghost type thing, that this is really strongly tied into dimensional time?
Not really. I think we use it as a cop-out. We warp space and time and things like that. Those words sound neat. How do you do it? Well, that's another problem. We don't worry about that. The thing is that they want to bring in magic. And I don't mean M-A-J-I-C. There's going to be a movie. It says here, Magic Men, about the Majestic 12, MJ-12. That's top secret magic. But they want to believe in magic. And so, I'm not a theoretical physicist. I'm not a higher mathematician at all. But we don't need to go that direction if we make use of what we have. Look at the Navy. They got sense. The first nuclear submarine, 1956, go around the world underwater. During World War II, a submarine was a surface ship that could stay underwater for 24 hours. They need air to run the diesel engines, you understand. The Navy has an aircraft carrier. Several navies have aircraft carriers that can operate for 18 years without refueling. Think about that for a minute. That's very impressive to me.
It's a long time at sea.
Yeah, and the nice thing is you can go full tilt all the time. If you don't have nuclear energy and you're in a war, where are you going to get your gasoline, Bring in the tanker. Splat. So, and, there's a step beyond that. The analogy here, and somebody gave me a hard time to give a little background here, that how could somebody come from another star system and crash? Come on, Stan, that's ridiculous. Well, the vehicle that comes from the other star system isn't the one that crashes. It's the distinction between the aircraft carrier, a huge monster that can operate for 18 years, and the little airplanes it carries, which can operate for 2 hours without refueling. So the interstellar vehicle is the big monster, the mothership. We have many reports of these. Half-mile to a mile long, that's a little larger than little Earth excursion modules. And so I try to get people, we have examples in our own situation where it makes sense. There are two different environments in the atmosphere of a planet and in the nothingness between the stars. And people who don't see that haven't thought about it. It's put the data out on the table. That's why I wrote books after a while. You get kind of, here's a permanent record. You don't need to listen carefully now. Read it later. On my website, www.stantonfriedman.com, you can find all my books and how to get them and so forth. And it's an enormous amount of information about the cover-up, about advanced technology. And it's funny, it's the astronomers who don't have the data, and they're the ones. The latest, last year, the British Astronomer Royal, in his infinite wisdom, said, only kooks see UFOs. Now, you'd think he would have cited a source. Here's this big study, and all the sightings turned out to be kooks or something like that. He didn't cite anything. And it's totally nonsensical if you look at the large-scale scientific studies. But he got away with it because he's the British Astronomer Royal. Mm-hmm. I mean, after all, he would only tell the truth, wouldn't he? No, he didn't do his homework. Somebody has to say that it's nonsense. And so I'm on a crusade all the time to correct the false impressions. I am a real fan of the Kepler spacecraft, the one that's been finding planets all over the place, It's exciting work and a very sophisticated system. But nobody in the SETI community wants to consider the possibility that one of these smart guys out there who's supposedly sending radio signals to us might have put out his Keplers 10,000 years ago, 10 million years ago. The planet, I'll admit, Pat Robertson says that the Earth is only 4,000, it was created in 4004 BC. Well, he also says that all the intelligent life in the universe is on Earth. And I question whether there's any intelligent life.
I question that every day.
Yeah, and he also thinks it was created, like I said, 4004 BC. Well, he left 6 zeros out of there. 4,000,004 BC, I'd buy into that. And it matters because we're not allowing that maybe somebody was smart there before we were. I mean, that's hard for the advanced people on the planet to believe. And so it's one of those crazy things when you look at the history of discovery in science and the resistance to the new and the different.
Yeah.
And the discoveries about things you can't see. That's where you look for something new. And my mantra is technological progress comes from doing things differently in an unpredictable way. The future is not an extrapolation of the past. You've got to change how you do things. A laser is not just a better light bulb. Entirely different physics. And until you recognize that you don't know everything, you're not going to learn something. And there are consequences when you listen to the noisy guys. One example I'd like to cite is that on November 29th, 1941, was the Army-Navy football game. And in the program, there was a picture of the USS Arizona, the huge battleship. And in the text with that picture was the statement that nobody has ever sunk a battleship from the sky. 8 days later was Pearl Harbor, and that ship went down to the bottom, killing 1,100 people. The Japanese knew you could sink a ship from the sky. So there were consequences.
Right.
And that's what you got to watch out for. Is in the medical world, one of my favorite guys is Dr. Semmelweis in Austria back in the early 19th century. He delivered babies. This is a new time. Women were going to hospitals to be delivered instead of giving birth at home. And so they had one section of the hospital that had in Vienna that had the midwives taking care of women, and 3% of them came down with childbed fever, which was invariably fatal. The doctors, the residents, did their autopsies upstairs, came down and examined the women, and 20% of their women came down with childbed fever. So Dr. Semmelweis had a friend with a needle stick who developed some of the same symptoms and died. And so he set up a whole new regime. You had to wash your hands between doing an autopsy and examining a pregnant woman. And you know what? The number of cases of childbed fever went down to 3%. and he lost his job. Because that's not how we do things here, said the boss of the hospital. Mm. Now, in his honor, they issued a stamp 100 years later. How many women died because somebody was paying foolish attention to a totally false notion? It's disheartening when you look at cases like this. How many people died from their ulcers before it was acknowledged that, it is a bacteria, which made a heck of a difference to the people who suffered from the condition. And there were people who fought against the vaccination, God's way of punishing us and controlling the population. It's foolishness. Well, some people showed it wasn't foolishness. It saved a lot of people. So it's this unwillingness to admit that maybe there's something I don't know. Let's check it out. And in the case of UFOs, first of all, there's the evidence for the sightings, the large-scale scientific studies, the physical trace cases, the radar visual sightings, and the proof, and I use that term not lightly, of the government cover-up. Well, how can you say you proved it, Stan? Well, look at these blacked-out CIA top-secret Umbra UFO documents on which you can read 6 words. Everything else is blacked out. Here's 156 NSA, National Security Agency. People are hearing about them these days.
Oh, yeah.
156 NSA UFO documents on which you can read 1 sentence per page. Everything else is whited out. And people say there is no cover-up. Well, you tell me what's under the whiteout or the blackout in the case of the CIA stuff. And let me put a statement on the table that the major media seem unwilling to deal with. Air Force General Carol Bolender was asked in mid-1969. He'd been working on the lunar excursion module. He was an engineer. And the University of Colorado study, the Condon report, earlier in the year had suggested that Project Blue Book, ostensibly the only government group concerned with citing UFO sightings, be canceled because it wasn't doing anything useful. I actually agree with that. But so they asked General Bolender, no previous connection, what should we do here? So he did a study, and he wrote a memo, which we didn't see until 10 years later, but that memo resulted in the closure of Project Blue Book. In it, he says, moreover, reports of UFOs which could affect national security are made in accordance with JNAP 146, or Air Force Manual 55-11, and are not part of the Blue Book system. 2 paragraphs later, he says, if we close Project Blue Book, there won't be anybody for the public to report sightings to. However, as previously noted, reports which could affect national security would continue to be investigated using the procedures designed for that purpose. No major media group has ever made that statement. Blue Book was it. It was canceled, and the Air Force has gotten away with lying since 1969. That aggravates me.
Yeah, Blue Book was set up to fail.
Well, yeah, I located Carol Bolender, General Bolender. I like looking for people whose names aren't too common. John Smith's are too hard to find the right one. And I found him and explained that I'd had a clearance for 14 years. I'd read his memo with interest, had a strong interest in UFOs. And I said, it sounds like you're saying that there are 2 separate communications channels, one for the sightings which could affect national security. For example, if a saucer went down the runway at a strategic air command base where nuclear weapons are stored, that's a national security problem, right? He agreed. I said the other for when people go out and see a UFO fly by, no big deal. You know, MUFON, incidentally, gets over 600 reports a month. So, common. And he agreed. And yet I've never seen the New York Times or the Washington Post or any of these point out, oh, yeah, the Air Force has been lying all this time when they said they're not doing anything about UFOs. The New York Times, all the news that's fit to print, well, except the stuff we don't want to print, Let me give you an example. My least favored explanation for Roswell crash test dummies.
Operation Mogul.
Now, no, that's separate.
Oh, Mogul was the weather balloons. Yeah.
Yeah, weather balloons. That's a long story, too. The reason I like the crash test dummies, it is true there was such a program. I mean, you better not put pilots on board when you're checking out the ejection seats the first few times around, And front page, Sunday edition, above the fold, the New York Times touted the crash test dummy explanation. Now, if they had talked to the guy who headed the program, and I did in person, they'd have found a couple of little problems. One, none of those dummies were dropped until 6 years after Roswell happened. So we got time travel for crash test dummies. I wish I could use it to travel around, though sometimes it gets a little aggravating. The second thing is, and there's a picture in the Air Force report, which has the guy that I talked to, a colonel who's dead now, and a dummy in the middle, and then another officer. He pointed out to me, he said, Stan, for the test to be meaningful, the dummies had to be the same size and weight as pilots. They were 6 feet tall and 175 pounds. And they were in flight gear, because that affects the drag and the heating of a body if a pilot, whatever, jumps out of an airplane at 43,000 feet. You might freeze to death before you get to the ground if you're not careful, Well, that was one of the questions. How soon should you open your parachute? And that's not a trivial question if you're the guy. But, I mean, that explanation, how could the New York Times print such garbage? But I'll give you another example. I grew up in New Jersey, so I'm not totally opposed to New York, although it might be reason enough. But Dr. Goddard, rocket scientist, after whom Goddard Space Center was named, in 1919 he published a paper, scientific paper, talking about rocketry, and he threw in a little short segment about they might work well in outer space. The New York Times said, the good doctor doesn't even know what every high school student knows, that you have to have something to react against with your exhaust, and if there's a vacuum, you don't have anything. They splashed that. They didn't correct that totally false statement until the Apollo command module was heading toward the moon. But they made it awful hard for him to get support to continue his research. And you know where he did most of his research? Roswell, New Mexico.
There you have it.
Nobody around there to complain. He was working in Connecticut where there are a lot of people. But what I'm getting at is, if you can't count on your media to do the job, and if you can't count on the scientific community to do the job, what do you do? I'm pleased that, for example, Wernher von Braun was in charge of getting us to the moon. And it looked like the way we do it would be to have 2 big Saturn V rockets rendezvous in orbit around the Earth, get together, separate out the right components, and then head what was left off to the moon. But that means 2 rocket launches. One engineer went to von Braun, had done a bunch of calculations, and showed him, you know what, we could get by with 1 launch if we had a lunar orbit rendezvous. And went through the paperwork, and von Braun looked at it, and that's what they did. And that's how we got to the moon, because they were listening to facts, to data, to solid reasoning, not bias, prejudice, ignorance. They were trying to get a job done. And so I'm one on the favor of let's get the job done. And that's why I mentioned the book, Science Was Wrong, because there's so many examples of the price we've paid. And when it comes to saucers, you'll hear some of the dumbest questions. Well, why would the government keep this secret? And fear of panic, that's what they always come up with, War of the Worlds kind of thing. And you try to point out we live in a world in which governments are spending billions of dollars every year to develop new and better flying systems. You know, faster, higher, farther, all that sort of thing. You don't think every government on the planet wouldn't like to get his mitts on wreckage of a flying saucer? Huh. Or on the data obtained by the instruments that only the government has? I don't know anybody who has their own radar system, for example, or gun cameras with which they could take pictures of the saucers they're chasing. You know, so the first thing, I'll give you 6 quick reasons for the cover-up. You want to figure out how the darn things work. You got wreckage. You set up a secret program. Rule number 1 for security is you can't tell your friends without telling your enemies. Sometimes people look at me a little strangely. I said, you know, the spies listen to the radio and read the newspapers too. You can't say, well, this is only for guys who are on our side.
So true.
The second problem is the other side of the coin. What if the other guy figures out how they work before you do? You don't want him to know. You know. He knows. You know. Weapon, counter-weapon, counter-weapon. We've been playing this game for a long time. The third problem is, what if there were an announcement tomorrow by highly trusted individuals around the world? That's a tough one. My favorite odd couple is the Queen and the Pope. What if they were to say, indeed, we have it on good authority that the planet is being visited. They're neutral, let's say, and we are announcing that there will be international conferences with representatives from many countries looking at the religious, economic, psychological, etc. aspects of this. What would happen? Church attendance would go up, mental hospital admissions would go up, the stock market would go down. But one of the biggest things that would happen, I believe, having lectured at many hundreds of colleges in all 50 states, so I get a pretty good sampling, and 10 provinces and 18 other countries, I think the younger generation, who unlike me was never alive when there wasn't a space program, would push for a new view of ourselves instead of as Americans, Canadians, Greeks, Peruvians, as Earthlings. I mean, obviously from an alien viewpoint, we are all Earthlings. We don't seem to like that very much. And there's the rub. You know any government that wants its citizens to owe their primary allegiance to the planet as opposed to that government? Nationalism's the only game in town as far as I can tell. The fourth problem is different. It's Pat Robertson again. All the intelligent life in the universe is here, and, you know, there's nothing. The Bible doesn't say anything about flying saucers, which isn't really true. Dr. Barry Downing has written an excellent book, The Bible and Flying Saucers. He's got a degree in physics and then a doctor of divinity, so divine physics is his speech. Darn good book. And the fifth problem, people say, well, Stan, look, if aliens are coming here, they're more advanced than we are, technologically. That means that maybe we'll be able to get rid of oil for producing energy. Oh, boy, that's a problem. And get rid of the ground vehicles and the air vehicles. Economic chaos. And I try to tell them, I say, look, the fact that we don't make many buggy whips anymore doesn't mean that our economy has badly suffered. We've been able to put up with doing new things because it takes a while to get adjusted. The last reason, of course, is that I have, on 7 different occasions, because I'm out there in the public eye and people have a chance to talk to me quietly, on 7 different occasions I've heard of cases where our military aircraft went up to chase UFOs and didn't come back. The orders were issued in 1952. Shoot them down if they don't land when instructed to do so. And a man named Frank Ficino has written a book about the Flatwoods Monster. Some titles of some editions are Shoot Them Down. But between 51 and 56, 200 fatal military plane crashes occurred in the United States. 5 of those guys, the pilots, had over 100 missions each in Korea. And think about that for a minute. You don't last 100 missions when you're being chased by MiGs, unless you're a darn good pilot. You come back to the United States, no MiGs flying around, and you crash. And in this case, the New York Times occasionally used words like disappeared and disintegrated. A strange way to describe what happens to an airplane. So we're ignorant of what's going on in the world. And that's a darn shame. I think we need to learn more.
I agree.
Yeah, absolutely. I have had a few we have a chat room that goes on during the show, and I've had a few questions, so if you wouldn't mind, I'll just have some random ones for you. I was asked earlier that someone was puzzled that why was there a change in terms from contactee to abductee when it comes to extraterrestrial interaction? All right.
Well, good question. It turns out there's a really good answer. There were no abduction cases reported. I didn't say that happened, but none that were reported really until the Betty and Barney Hill case of 1961. Up in New Hampshire, my book captured Kathleen Marden, did 85% of the work, Betty's niece.
Okay.
And it's on my website and so forth. She did a great job. But that was 1961, and the first book, The Interrupted Journey, didn't come out until 65. Well, the contactees were around before that, and nobody was looking at them carefully, and the government was just as happy that people would focus on crazy stories, wonderful Venusians and all that sort of thing. And they're telling everybody how to save the world was an entirely different thing. The Hill case, which the central investigation, if you will, was done by Dr. Benjamin Simon, a psychiatrist who was a world-class expert on treating PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Shell-shock war veterans, they called them back then. He ran a hospital that had 3,000 beds for guys who had problems from the Second World War. So he didn't know anything about flying saucers. But he's the guy who did the hypnosis, 10 sessions each. And he knew how to get people back amongst the living after suffering their PTSD stuff. And so that case set a whole new ballgame for what was going on. And also, look, Betty was a social worker. Barney worked for the post office, but he was on a governor's civil rights commission. It was a mixed marriage in New Hampshire, which was a pretty gutsy thing to do in 1961. I think it's fair enough to say. And so it suddenly other people were reporting reluctantly, but willing to say something similar had happened to them. And Betty and Barney didn't bring back any messages for society. Stop your nuclear weapons testing, that was one of the common ones. And it was an easy train to get on. Who could object to somebody being told that we got to be better people? Sure we do. I'm not saying that. But evidence wasn't the concern. George Adamski and a whole bunch of other people, Daniel Fry, and nobody was investigating these guys. I like to check on people's credentials. I mean, if a guy calls himself doctor, you want to know, okay, so where'd you get your doctorate? What was it in? And you can check on those things. I've done a lot of checking. And I've often asked, do you get a lot of calls about people who claim to have a degree from your institution? All the time was the answer I got. And who didn't have those degrees.
Right.
That's the important thing. I'm not saying you need a degree to do anything, but if you're going to claim you got one, you better have it.
Yeah, that's.
You need to tell the truth. That's what I'm saying. So it's a whole new ballgame with the abductees as opposed to the contactees. And I checked on a number of contactees who were lying through their teeth. What can I say?
I was just sitting here looking at another question, trying to get these in. Has our government ever hired psychics or remote viewers for any reason?
Yes, as a matter of fact, there was what's his name? I can picture him. They did try to find out where Russian spies were coming from, what information was available. Yes, remote viewing has been used. And look, it's not 100%. Ain't nothing 100%. But you pay a baseball player an awful lot of money to get a hit a third of the time, don't you? If he bats .333, boy, he's worth millions a year. That means 2/3 of the time he isn't getting a hit. So, yes, remote viewers have been used, and I wish I could remember the guy's name. I met with somebody, and we went over some of the stuff he'd been doing. Most of it classified.
I was going to say something, actually, it just strikes me that I even recall hearing something, but I didn't know if it was, on the record, so to say, or off. And I think it was, I want to say in the late 60s, 70s, that actually happened. But anyway.
Yeah.
Greg.
Yes.
I know that we are going to have to let Stanton go soon. So is there any particular questions that you have?
He covered it, man. I'm good. I could sit and listen to him for 4 more hours, easily. I'm good, man. He's done awesome.
Well, you got to read my books then. It's faster than listening.
Yeah. When I met you in Burlington, Wisconsin a couple years ago, and you autographed a copy of the book that I had. Yeah, so it's one of my favorites. I've read it multiple times already.
Yeah.
Good.
He was talking about the fact before you were on is that when we were like, well, can we get him? He says, well, I can just start reading from one of his books here.
And I got to tell you,
some of the dynamism when you just read the books.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I was going to tell you, I'm a big fan of your articles in UFO Magazine. I'm a subscriber. I read your articles all the time.
Don't forget the MUFON Journal. I have a regular column in there.
Oh, well, okay. Something new to read then.
Yes. Yeah, it's listed, like I say, at my website, www.stantonfriedman.com. It tells you how to get the books and, gives you the information so you don't need to... Do I have to tell you that there's a lot of junk on the Internet?
Well, you know what? I do want to let everybody listening to know that, excuse me, that we will have your website will be posted on the show site. Okay. So we do have links that go out for you. And I will have actually a list of a couple of the books there, but you can just link out and get to everything Stanton.
Yeah.
And that will show you where you're going to appear if you have any appearances coming up, or so on and so forth. But thank you so much for agreeing to be on the show and for sharing your time with us. You've made a lot of people happy, and me included. So
good. I appreciate that. I grew up with radio, incidentally, so I appreciate being on radio.
Awesome.
Don't need to wear a necktie.
Exactly. You could be sitting at home in your slippers and be all comfortable with your favorite drink, and no one knows the difference.
You're right.
So thank you, Stanton, for being
my pleasure.
On the show, and you have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you. Good night.
Good night.
I got goose pimples, man. That was awesome.
I know. He's just so incredibly smart.
He is. And when I met him in Burlington, all the questions that I had, to be honest with you, I mean, you read his few books, and not to say that you don't have a lot of questions, but if you read his books, he kind of answers everything right there. And I implore any of you who don't have his books, for God's sake, start getting his books, especially to start off with Flying Saucers and Science, because, again, he talks a lot about propulsion, about how it is possible to get from there to here with things, as far as he tap danced on it before about, well, there's no way they could possibly get here. He talks about these issues. And then he goes on further to discuss the Majestic 12 and the top secret government documents that are mostly all blacked out. So if it's still blacked out, I guess I'd call that a conspiracy, because they really don't want you to know. And what's underneath the blacked out stuff, we'll never know. but he talks an awful lot about that. And go to his website, man. Read his website. Get yourself a UFO magazine subscription and read his stuff. He's a fascinating guy. I could listen again. I said it, and I mean it. I could listen to him talk for hours.
One thing I really I don't admire or enjoyed in listening to him is he's very versatile.
Yes.
He is just so educated on so many different topics that I just had this feeling like I could probably just throw just about anything at him and he would have an intelligent answer for it, or at least a one that sounded really good.
Yeah, and even if it wasn't true, if it come out of his mouth, by God, I'd believe it.
Yes.
Not that he would say things that aren't true. I'm saying he's very
right.
His answers are very intelligently thought through.
Yeah, absolutely. To listen to more shows and interviews like this one, or full episodes of the Paranormal MD Radio Show, please go to theparanormalmdradio.com.